There is a moment, somewhere deep in the human experience, that every person alive has felt. A door left slightly open, a letter not meant for your eyes, a question you were told never to ask. And in that moment, the pull is not toward caution. The pull is toward knowing. It has always been this way, long before psychology gave it a name, long before philosophy tried to contain it within argument and reason. The ancient Greeks looked at this hunger in the human soul, and they told a story. They told the story of Pandora. It begins, as so many great tragedies do, not with destruction, but with creation. In the age before human suffering had a name, the Titan Prometheus had stolen fire from the gods on Mount Olympus and gifted it to mankind. It was an act of love. It was also an act of defiance so bold, so absolute, that Zeus, king of the gods, was left shaking with fury. And Zeus, who had ruled the cosmos since before memory, understood something that Prometheus in his compassion had overlooked. Every gift, in the hands of the powerful, can be turned into a weapon. So Zeus did not rage blindly. He planned. He gathered the gods of Olympus together and instructed them to build something that had never existed before, something beautiful, something irresistible, something that would undo the very gift Prometheus had so proudly given. They called her Pandora, meaning, in the old tongue, all gifted. For each of the gods contributed something to her making. Aphrodite gave her beauty so extraordinary it could silence a room. Hermes gave her a silver tongue and a curious mind. Athena dressed her with hands skilled enough to rival the craftwork of the immortals themselves. Hephaestus shaped her form from the earth with the same hands that had forged the weapons of gods. She was, by every measure, perfect. She was also, by every design, a trap. When Pandora was delivered to the earth, she was accompanied by something else, a vessel, often described as a large jar in the earliest Greek tellings, later transformed by centuries of translation into the image of a box, ornate and sealed, given to her with a single devastating instruction. Do not open it, no explanation, no warning of what lay inside, only the command and the lock and the silence of a closed lid. What was inside that vessel is the part of the story that stops the breath. Zeus had collected within it every misery that could afflict the human race. Disease, grief, famine, envy, hatred, madness, old age that robs the body of everything it once could do, war in all its forms, toil so relentless it hollows a person from the inside out, deceit, jealousy, despair so heavy it makes the simple act of waking in the morning feel like a negotiation with the darkness. Every curse, every suffering, every invisible wound that could be visited upon a human life was pressed into that vessel and sealed beneath its lid. And Pandora opened it, not out of malice, not out of wickedness, out of the most human impulse in the world, curiosity, the need to know, the unbearable weight of a question left unanswered. In an instant, everything inside poured out into the world and scattered to the farthest corners of the earth, and nothing in human history would ever be the same again. The Golden Age, that period the Greeks described as an era without suffering, without toil, without the slow erosion of hope, ended in a single breath. And when Pandora finally managed to close the lid again, pressing it shut with trembling hands, only one thing remained inside. Elpis, the spirit of hope. Whether hope was imprisoned there to comfort mankind in the suffering that had just been unleashed, or whether hope itself was one more ambiguous gift from a calculating God, the Greeks wisely never quite resolved. This is what makes the myth extraordinary, not the horror of what escaped, though that horror is real and worth sitting with, but the question it leaves behind, the one it has been leaving behind for nearly 3,000 years. What does it mean that the thing which undoes us is also the thing that defines us, that the hunger to know, to open, to see what is behind the closed door, is not a flaw in the human character, but perhaps the very center of it. Today, in boardrooms and laboratories, in political chambers and private conversations, when someone says that a decision might open Pandora's box, everyone in the room understands immediately. No explanation is required. No mythology degree is necessary. 3,000 years have passed, and the image holds. A closed lid, awaiting darkness, and the hand that cannot quite stop itself from reaching. That is where we begin. To understand what Pandora's box unleashed upon the world, you first have to understand the world it was unleashed into. Because the Greece that told this story was not telling it in a vacuum. It was not a tale invented to frighten children at bedtime or fill empty hours around a fire. It was an attempt, serious and sincere, to answer one of the oldest questions a conscious mind can produce. Why do we suffer? Why is life, for all its beauty, threaded through with pain so persistent and so varied that no human being escapes it? The Greeks did not flinch from that question. They walked straight into it, and they built a mythology, vast and elaborate enough to hold the answer. But before Pandora, before the box, before the gods of Olympus gathered to construct their most calculated act of divine retribution, there was a different world entirely. The Greeks called it the Age of Gold, and the poet Hesiod, writing in the 8th century before the Common Era, described it with a longing so vivid you can feel the weight of what was lost. Hesiod is our primary source for the Pandora myth, and it is worth pausing on that for a moment, because Hesiod was not writing fantasy, he was writing theology. He was writing history as the ancient world understood it, the record of how things came to be the way they are, told through the language of gods and heroes and forces larger than individual men. In the Age of Gold, Hesiod tells us, humanity lived like gods themselves. There was no toil. The earth gave up its fruits freely, without the breaking of backs or the blistering of hands. There was no disease to hollow the body from within. There was no old age, no slow theft of strength and memory and dignity. People lived, and then, when their time came, they simply slipped into sleep, as gently as a tide going out, and did not wake again. It was, by any measure, paradise, and it was, by the internal logic of Greek mythology, entirely real, not metaphor, not wishful thinking, a true era of human existence that preceded the one the Greeks themselves were living in. After the Age of Gold came the Age of Silver, and already the light was dimming. The people of the Silver Age were lesser beings, still blessed by modern standards, but proud in ways that offended the gods, and slow to offer the reverence that Olympus demanded. Zeus, who is rarely described in mythology as patient, swept them away. Then came the Age of Bronze, populated by men who knew nothing but war, who were so consumed by violence that they destroyed themselves without requiring any divine intervention at all. After Bronze came the Age of Heroes, that brief, luminous era of Achilles and Odysseus and Heracles, where human greatness flickered at its brightest before being extinguished on the plains of Troy and in the labyrinths of impossible quests. And then, after all of that, came the age Hesiod himself was living in, the age of iron, the age of suffering, the age of toil and grief and injustice, where good men die young and cruel, men prosper, and the gods seem, most days, very far away. Pandora is the hinge between all of that beauty and all of this pain. She is the explanation. And to appreciate the full weight of what she represents, you need to understand who placed her there and why. Zeus is not, in Greek mythology, a simple villain. He is something considerably more uncomfortable than that. He is power without sentimentality. He is order maintained through whatever means order requires. When Prometheus stole fire from Mount Olympus and carried it down to humanity in the hollow of a fennel stalk, he was not simply handing mankind a tool for warmth or cooking. Fire, in the Greek understanding, was the foundation of civilization itself. Metallurgy, weaponry, the forging of cities, the capacity to reshape the natural world according to human will. To give humanity fire was to close the gap between mortal and divine, and Zeus understood this in a way Prometheus, for all his foresight, the very meaning of his name, had chosen to ignore. The punishment Zeus devised for Prometheus is among the most brutal images in all of ancient mythology. Prometheus was chained to a mountain, a great rock in the Caucasus, and each day an eagle, some traditions say it was the eagle of Zeus himself, would descend and tear open his abdomen and consume his liver. And each night, because Prometheus was immortal, the liver would grow back entirely. And each morning the eagle would return. This went on, by various accounts, for 30 years, for thousands of years, for an eternity, until Heracles, passing by on one of his labors, took pity on the Titan and drove an arrow through the eagle's throat. But the punishment of Prometheus was always understood to be personal, one immortal being paying the price for one act of defiance. Zeus was thinking on a larger scale than that. Prometheus had given humanity something that elevated them. Zeus would give humanity something that would bring them low. And so the order went out. Build me a woman. The involvement of every Olympian god in Pandora's creation is not a minor detail. It is the entire point. This was not an improvised response. It was a collaborative, deliberate, exquisitely planned act of cosmic engineering. When Hesiod lists the contributions of each god to Pandora's making, he is cataloging the resources of heaven itself being marshaled toward a single purpose. Aphrodite's beauty ensures that Pandora will be welcomed. Hermes' persuasive tongue ensures she will be trusted. Athena's skill with craft and textile gives her the appearance of competence and grace. Even her name, all gifted, is part of the architecture of the trap. A name that sounds like blessing and functions like a weapon. She is sent first to Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus, whose name means, with devastating irony, hindsight. Where Prometheus saw ahead, Epimetheus understood only after. Prometheus had warned his brother specifically, do not accept any gift from Zeus. Do not trust the hand of the king of the gods when it opens in generosity. Epimetheus, confronted with Pandora, forgot every word of that warning. Of course he did. That was the design, the vessel Pandora carried with her. And here the history of translation becomes genuinely fascinating. Was described by Hesiod with the Greek word pithos. A pithos was a large storage jar, the kind used throughout the ancient Mediterranean world to store grain, olive oil, and wine. It was a mundane object, in one sense, entirely familiar to every Greek who heard the story. But a pithos was also a significant object. These jars could be enormous, large enough to hold a person, and they were used not only for food storage but in some traditions for burial. There is an argument, and scholars have made it seriously, that the original vessel in the myth carried with it the double resonance of sustenance and death. The same container that fed, you could also receive your body when you were gone. The transformation of pithos into box is one of the most consequential mistranslations in literary history. It happened in the 16th century, when the Dutch philosopher Erasmus, working with the original Greek texts, rendered pithos as pyxis, a small box or casket. The image caught. It spread through European culture, through Renaissance painting and poetry, and later through every language that inherited the story from those paintings and poems. The box is now so fixed in the popular imagination that to correct it feels almost impertinent. And yet the correction matters, because a box is portable, personal, intimate, a thing you carry with you. A jar that large is fixed, communal, a thing belonging to a household. The original image suggests that suffering was stored in the architecture of the world itself. The later image suggests that one woman carried it in her hands. The difference in implication is not small. What poured out of the vessel, in either version, is worth cataloguing slowly, because the Greeks were not vague about it. Hesiod names the contents with the specificity of someone who had looked directly at human misery and categorized what he saw. Ponos, brutal toil, the kind that wears the body down across decades until a person is old before their time. Limos, starvation, not merely hunger, but the consuming desperation of genuine famine. Algia, in the plural, the pains, physical suffering in its many forms. Dysnomia, lawlessness, the collapse of justice and social order. 8. Ruin, the specific madness that leads a person to make the decision that destroys everything they have built. Nemesis, in some versions, divine retribution, the sense that suffering arrives not randomly but as consequence. And beneath all of these, filling the spaces between them, all the diseases that would afflict the human body, which Hesiod says had previously moved through the world in silence without warning, by the will of Zeus, because Zeus had taken even the mercy of visible illness from humanity along with everything else. And then Elpis, hope, remaining inside, alone, when the lid came down. The debate over what this means has occupied philosophers and scholars for centuries and shows no sign of resolution, which suggests it is exactly the kind of question the myth intended to generate. Is hope a comfort deliberately left for mankind, a mercy in the chaos, or is hope the cruelest content of all, the thing that keeps us reaching, striving, suffering longer than we otherwise might, because we cannot stop believing tomorrow will be different? Hesiod describes Elpis as remaining beneath the lip of the jar, never flying out, which some have interpreted as hope being preserved for humanity, and others as hope being imprisoned, kept from us just as fully as if it had never existed. The ambiguity is not an accident. The Greeks lived in it. They built temples to gods who they knew could be capricious and cruel. They prayed to powers they understood might not be listening. They suffered, and they hoped, and they were never entirely sure whether hoping made the suffering better or simply prolonged it. This is what makes Pandora's story something far beyond a simple cautionary tale about a woman who did not follow instructions. It is a cosmological argument, a statement about the structure of existence, a claim that suffering is not a malfunction of the world, but a feature of it, built in deliberately by minds greater than ours, for reasons we may never fully understand. 3,000 years have passed since Hesiod first wrote those words on parchment, and we are still asking the same questions. We have more tools now, more science, more medicine, more accumulated human knowledge than any civilization in history could have imagined. And still, on any given morning in any given life, the question rises up as raw and immediate as it ever was. Why this? Why now? Why me? The Greeks did not promise an answer. They only promised that the question was as old as the world, and that the vessel had already been opened, and that whatever hope remained was still, somehow, inside. There is a particular kind of unfairness that history does quietly, without announcement, without visible malice, simply by repeating the story often enough that the repetition becomes the truth. Pandora has suffered this unfairness for nearly 3,000 years. She has been flattened, reduced, simplified into a cautionary archetype, the woman who could not help herself, the woman whose curiosity broke the world, the woman whose name has become shorthand for catastrophic feminine meddling in things better left alone. And in accepting that reduction without examination, we have missed something. We have missed the far more interesting, far more honest, and far more troubling story that the myth is actually telling. Pandora did not choose to be made. She did not choose the vessel, did not choose the instruction, did not choose the world she was placed into or the man she was placed beside. She was constructed, gifted, delivered, and given one rule so irresistible in its impossibility that it functioned less like a boundary and more like an invitation. In any honest reading of the myth, the question of blame dissolves almost immediately upon contact with the actual details. What remains is something more complex and more worth our attention: the question of what Pandora represents, not as a symbol of female weakness, but as a mirror held up to the entire human condition. To understand how Pandora came to carry the weight of blame she has carried, it helps to understand that she did not arrive in Greek mythology alone. She arrived alongside a parallel story from another culture, one so structurally similar that scholars have spent considerable time examining the relationship between them. The story of Eve in the Hebrew tradition predates its written form around the same broad historical era as Hesiod's works, and the architecture of the two stories is striking in its resemblance. A woman, a prohibition, a fateful act of reaching for forbidden knowledge, the unleashing of suffering into a world that had previously been without it. The finger of consequence pointed in one direction. This parallel is not offered here to diminish either story, but to illuminate something important. Both myths were produced by cultures navigating the same fundamental human anxiety. The world contains suffering. That suffering must have an origin, and in the cosmological imagination of these ancient civilizations, the origin required a face, a moment, a hand that reached. The assignment of that hand to a woman was not, in either tradition, the result of simple misogyny, though misogyny would certainly amplify and extend the interpretation across centuries. It was the result of something older and stranger and worth examining directly. The fear of the unknown combined with the fear of the unfamiliar. In societies structured around male authority and divine masculine power, the introduction of something new, something created rather than born, something beautiful and capable and curious, was itself understood as a form of disruption. Pandora was trouble before she ever touched the lid, because she was change, and change, in the cosmological thinking of the ancient world, was almost never innocent. Hesiod himself is not neutral on this subject, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. His two major works, the Theogony and Works and Days, both contain passages about women that are, by any modern standard, deeply unkind. He describes the female sex as a burden upon men, a beautiful evil, a plague in exchange for fire. He uses Pandora not merely as a mythological figure, but as a statement about the nature of women generally, and that statement is not generous. But here, the careful reader of history has to do two things simultaneously: acknowledge what Hesiod wrote, and take it seriously as a document of his time and culture, and refuse to allow his particular 8th century framing to be the final word on a myth that has survived long enough to be read in 1,000 different lights. Because what the myth shows us, when we look at it without Hesiod's editorial framing, is not a foolish or wicked woman. It shows us a being of extraordinary curiosity placed in an impossible situation, and doing what any curious, conscious being would do. It shows us the human condition in a female form, which is perhaps exactly why it disturbed the cultures that inherited it so profoundly. For centuries, the Western world was deeply uncomfortable with the idea that curiosity, the engine of every human advance in knowledge, science, art, and understanding, could be the same force that brings suffering into the world. It was far easier to assign that discomfort to women and be done with it. And so Pandora became a warning. She appeared in Renaissance paintings as a seductive figure, clutching an ornate casket, her expression somewhere between innocence and calculation. She appeared in Enlightenment allegory as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked desire. She appeared in Victorian poetry as a tragic beauty whose nature was always already her flaw. In each era, the culture reached into the myth and pulled out the version of Pandora It needed to justify whatever anxieties it was carrying at the time. The woman was infinitely adaptable as a symbol because she had been so thoroughly emptied of personhood in the original telling. But in the 20th century, something shifted. As scholarship on ancient Greek culture deepened, as feminist academics began examining classical mythology with fresh and rigorous attention, Pandora started to be read differently. Scholars such as Jane Ellen Harrison, writing in the early decades of the century, argued that Pandora predated Hesiod's telling entirely, and that in older pre-Olympian traditions, she may have been something closer to a goddess of the earth, a figure of abundance and gift-giving rather than catastrophe. The name All Gifted in this earlier reading was not a description of what the gods poured into her as a trap, but of what she herself gave to the world: fertility, harvest, the gifts of the living earth. This earlier Pandora, if Harrison and those who followed her are correct, was written over. The arrival of the Olympian tradition, with its hierarchies and its strongly gendered power structures, its thunderbolt king, and its carefully maintained divine order, absorbed an older goddess and recast her as a cautionary tale. The woman who gave became the woman who took away. The figure of abundance became the figure of loss, and the vessel that may once have represented the fullness of the earth, the great storage jar of grain and oil and wine, became the container of every human misery. Whether or not this reconstruction of an earlier Pandora is precisely accurate, and the honest answer is that we cannot know with certainty, it reorients the entire myth in a way that rewards serious attention. It suggests that the story we have inherited is not the story that always existed, but one version of many, shaped by the particular anxieties and power structures of a particular cultural moment, which means that Pandora herself, as a mythological figure, is a palimpsest, a surface that has been written on, scraped clean, and written on again, with traces of each previous version still legible beneath the current text, if you know how to look. What those traces suggest is a figure considerably more interesting than the careless woman who doomed humanity. They suggest a being who stands at the intersection of creation and destruction, abundance and loss, knowledge and consequence, in the same way that every genuinely powerful mythological figure must stand, at the place where simple answers collapse and true questions begin. And the true question at the center of Pandora's story is not, as centuries of retelling have suggested, why did she open it? The true question, the one that has enough depth to hold 3,000 years of human examination, is this: what does it mean that the same act, the act of opening, of seeking, of refusing to accept the boundary of the closed lid, is simultaneously the source of all human suffering and the only mechanism by which human beings have ever learned anything at all? Every piece of knowledge humanity has ever acquired came from the same impulse that moved Pandora's hands. Every scientific discovery, every philosophical breakthrough, every moment of genuine understanding that has pulled the species forward in its long and complicated progress across the centuries, all of it required someone to ignore the instruction that said, "Stop, do not go further, leave this alone." All of it required the opened lid, the suffering that came with it. The disease and the grief and the toil and the despair is real. The myth does not ask us to pretend otherwise, and we should not, but neither should we accept the simplification that the opening was a mistake. The Greeks, in their best moments, were too honest for that simplification. They understood that the world could not be one thing cleanly, that the same hands that release destruction can be the ones reaching for understanding. That Pandora, in the end, is not a warning about women or about curiosity or about the foolishness of the human heart. She is a portrait of it, a portrait so accurate, so quietly devastating in its honesty, that we have been trying to look away from it, by blaming her, by reducing her, by making her the villain of her own story for nearly 3,000 years. She deserves better than that. And more importantly, so does the truth she carries. There is something the human mind does instinctively when confronted with suffering it cannot explain. It names it. It categorizes it, sorts it, assigns it a word or a face or a story, because a named thing, however terrible, is a contained thing. A thing that can be pointed at, spoken of, and in some partial and imperfect way, understood. The ancient Greeks were perhaps the most sophisticated practitioners of this instinct that any civilization has produced. They did not simply say that life contained pain. They looked at pain in all its forms, held each variation up to the light, and gave every one of them a name, a lineage, a place in the order of things. When Hesiod described what poured from Pandora's vessel, he was not writing poetry in the decorative sense. He was writing a taxonomy of human suffering, a careful, considered inventory of every affliction that the Greeks recognized as the defining conditions of mortal life. And that inventory, when examined slowly and seriously, reveals something extraordinary. Not the primitive superstition that later centuries sometimes condescendingly assigned to ancient mythological thinking, but a psychological and social map of human misery, so precise in its observations that its categories remain recognizable in the 21st century with almost no translation required. Begin with ponos, brutal, unrelenting toil, not the satisfying labor of a craftsman shaping something beautiful with skilled hands, but the grinding, compulsory work that wears a person down across years and decades, until the body is spent and the spirit has forgotten what it once wanted from life. Hesiod's original audience understood this intimately. These were farming people, Mediterranean smallholders working difficult land under a demanding sun. People for whom the gap between a good harvest and starvation was measured in weeks. Ponos was not an abstraction to them. It was the specific ache in the lower back at the end of the 10th consecutive hour in a field. It was the hands that could no longer fully close in winter. It was the knowledge that tomorrow would ask the same of you that today had, and the day after that, stretching forward without visible end. That this suffering was named, acknowledged, given a place in the divine order of things, was itself a form of recognition. You suffer this way because it was released into the world, not because you deserve it, not because you failed, because the lid was opened and this is what came out. Then limos, famine. The Greeks gave starvation its own spirit, because they understood that hunger in its most extreme form is not merely physical deprivation, it is a transformation of the person. Limos does not simply empty the stomach, it empties the mind of everything that is not hunger, strips away dignity and social bond, and the capacity for generosity, and replaces all of it with a single consuming need. The Greeks had seen famine. The ancient Mediterranean was not a stable agricultural environment. Drought, blight, the disruption of trade routes, the aftermath of war, all of these produced the conditions Limos represented, and a civilization that named its worst experiences gave them a specificity that kept the memory of them alive across generations as a form of cultural warning. Algia, the pains, came next, and the plural is important. The Greeks did not reduce physical suffering to a single entity because they had paid close enough attention to know that pain is not singular. There is the sharp, immediate pain of injury, which announces itself and commands the entire attention of the body. There is the chronic pain that settles into joints and muscles and becomes, over years, a kind of weather system. The sufferer learns to live around. There is the pain of illness, which carries with it not only physical sensation but the particular existential terror of a body turning against itself. And there is what we might today call psychosomatic pain, the suffering of the mind that expresses itself through the body, which the Greeks understood perhaps better than we give them credit for. They gave these sufferings a collective name and a collective home in the myth, because they understood something we still struggle to fully articulate. that pain in its various forms is not an interruption to human life, but one of its persistent conditions. Dysnomia, the spirit of lawlessness and civil disorder, is where the catalogue becomes most interesting to a modern reader, because its presence in the vessel reveals something about how the Greeks understood the relationship between personal suffering and social suffering. Dysnomia is not an illness of the individual body. It is an illness of the body politic. It is what happens to a community when the structures that hold it together, law, mutual obligation, shared civic identity, begin to fray and fail. The Greeks placed it alongside disease and famine in the same vessel, not because they confused categories, but because they understood that social disorder produces suffering as concrete and as devastating as any plague. A city without law is a city in which the weak are consumed by the strong, in which the accumulated protections of civilization dissolve overnight, in which every individual fear is amplified by the absence of the collective reassurance that order provides. Dysnomia in the vessel was a statement. The breakdown of society is not a political problem separate from the human condition. It is the human condition at its most exposed. Ate deserves particular attention because of all the spirits released from Pandora's vessel. Ate is perhaps the one with the most psychological sophistication. She is the spirit of ruin, but ruin of a very specific kind. Not the ruin that arrives from outside, from flood or enemy army or divine punishment descending from above. Ate is the ruin that comes from within. She is the madness that leads a person to the decision that undoes them. The Greeks had a profound understanding of this phenomenon. The moment when a person of intelligence and capability, someone who should know better, who in calmer circumstances would know better, is seized by a blindness that leads them directly and with apparent confidence into catastrophe. You see Ate at work throughout Greek tragedy. You see her in Oedipus, pressing forward in his investigation, even when every sign points toward a truth too terrible to bear. You see her in Agamemnon, making the series of decisions that will lead inevitably to his murder in his own bath. You see her in Ajax, whose wounded pride curdles into a madness that ends in his own destruction. The Greeks were not content to simply observe that people sometimes make terrible decisions. They personified the force that drives those decisions, named it, placed it in the vessel, and said, "This too was released." This capacity for self-destruction is not a character flaw unique to the individual. It is a condition of human existence, part of the inheritance we all received when the lid came off. Among the diseases released, the Greeks were specific in ways that continue to reward attention. Many traditions identify individual ailments by name as having emerged from the vessel. Fevers, wasting illnesses, the kind of disease that moves invisibly through a population, that no individual can protect themselves from through virtue or vigilance or strength. The inclusion of disease in the vessel, alongside social and psychological suffering, was a deliberate act of mythological reasoning. It said, there is no category of human suffering that stands outside this story. The body, the mind, the community, the individual soul, all of it is touched by what was released. All of it belongs to the same inheritance. And threading through all of these named spirits, giving them a kind of connective tissue, was Eris. Discord. The force that does not simply make people suffer individually, but sets them against each other, compounds private pain with social conflict, and ensures that suffering is never entirely a solitary experience. Eris had her own mythology, separate from the Pandora story. She was the goddess who threw the golden apple that began the chain of events leading to the Trojan War. But her presence in the larger framework of what the vessel unleashed speaks to something the Greeks understood with uncomfortable clarity. Human beings in pain tend to turn on each other. Discord is not merely a consequence of suffering, it is a multiplier of it. What is striking when you stand back and look at the full catalogue, is its comprehensiveness without being its cruelty. This was not a list compiled by a culture that hated humanity or despaired of it. It was a list compiled by a culture that was paying attention, a culture honest enough to look at the full range of human experience and refuse to leave any of it unnamed, unacknowledged, unsituated within a larger story that gave it meaning, because that is what the naming ultimately accomplished. It took suffering out of the realm of pure randomness, which is perhaps the most terrifying place for suffering to live, and placed it within a narrative. You suffer these things not because the universe is indifferent, not because your pain is meaningless noise in an empty cosmos, but because once, at the beginning of the human story, a vessel was opened, and these were what it held. Your pain has an origin, it has a name, it belongs to the same story as everyone else's pain. There is a strange and genuine comfort in that, even now, perhaps especially now, when the scientific worldview has stripped away the mythological container and left us with suffering that is real and measurable, but narratively homeless. The Greeks, in naming every horror that emerged from Pandora's vessel, were doing something deeply humane. They were saying, "We see it. We know what it is. You are not alone in it." And somehow, across 3,000 years, that still sounds like something worth hearing. There is a detail in the Pandora myth so small, so easily passed over in the rush toward the drama of what was released, that it is possible to hear the story a dozen times and never fully stop to consider it. Every horror in the vessel, every named and unnamed suffering that scattered to the corners of the earth the moment the lid was lifted, left. That was the design. That was the point. The contents of the vessel were meant to disperse, to spread through the world of human experience and embed themselves so thoroughly that no corner of mortal life would remain untouched. And they did exactly that. They left completely, immediately, irreversibly. But one thing did not leave. Elpis, the spirit of hope, remained inside the vessel when Pandora pressed the lid back down. Alone, in the dark, in a container that had just held every form of human misery the divine imagination could produce. Hope stayed. Sit with that image for a moment, because it is genuinely strange when you look at it directly, not comforting in the easy way that the story is sometimes told, as though hope remaining behind was simply a mercy, a consolation prize tucked in at the bottom by a god who is not entirely without kindness. It is stranger than that, and more honest than that, and the Greeks knew it was stranger than that, which is why they never resolved it cleanly, and why the debate it generated has continued without interruption for nearly 30 centuries. The first interpretation, the one most commonly offered and most comfortable to receive, is that hope was preserved deliberately, that in the architecture of what Zeus designed, some thread of grace was woven in alongside the suffering, some acknowledgement that humanity, even in its diminished and pain-filled state, deserved a reason to continue. In this reading, Elpis at the bottom of the vessel is an act of divine mercy, the last gift in a container of gifts, the one that makes the others bearable. This is the interpretation that has traveled best through Western culture, that has been painted and carved and written into poetry across centuries of artistic engagement with the myth. Hope remained, and so humanity endures. The logic is clean, the image is beautiful, the comfort is real, even if it is not the whole story. The second interpretation is considerably less comfortable and considerably more interesting. What if hope remaining in the vessel was not mercy but its opposite? What if Elpis, sealed away beneath the lid, was as much a curse as everything that had already escaped? The Greek understanding of hope was not identical to the modern one. In contemporary usage, hope carries almost entirely positive connotations. To hope is to look forward, to believe in the possibility of better, to refuse the surrender of despair. but the Greeks were more ambivalent. The word elpis carried a broader range of meaning than the English translation suggests. It referred not only to the expectation of good things, but to expectation itself, the anticipation of future states, both positive and negative. And in some philosophical traditions, particularly among the Stoics who would inherit and develop Greek thought in the centuries following Hesiod, hope was explicitly grouped alongside fear as a source of human suffering rather than a relief from it. The argument goes like this: a person who does not hope cannot be disappointed. A person who has relinquished the expectation of better cannot have that expectation crushed when better does not arrive. The suffering of disappointed hope, the specific anguish of having believed that things would improve and then watching them fail to do so, is a form of pain that would not exist without hope's prior presence. If elpis is sealed in the vessel, and therefore always slightly out of reach, always present enough to be felt but never fully available to be grasped, then it functions as a kind of eternal torment. The knowledge that hope exists, without the ability to fully possess it, keeps humanity reaching and striving and suffering through the reaching and striving, when a clean and hopeless despair might, in some austere philosophical sense, actually hurt less. Hesiod himself does not resolve this tension. He describes elpis as remaining under the lip of the vessel, which some translators read as remaining safely inside, preserved for humanity, and others read as straining upward, trying to escape, confined against its nature. The Greek is genuinely ambiguous, and that ambiguity is either a failure of precision or a masterpiece of it, depending on how much credit you are willing to extend to a poet writing in the 8th century before the Common Era. The philosopher Nietzsche, writing in the 19th century, offered what remains one of the most provocative readings of elpis in the vessel. He argued that hope is the most evil of all the contents, precisely because it prolongs human suffering. In his reading, the cruelest thing in the container was the last thing, the diseases, and the grief, and the toil. Those were acute. They struck, and they hurt, and they passed, or they killed, but they were at least honest in their nature. Hope was different. Hope made people endure what they might otherwise refuse to endure. It kept them in suffering by promising an exit from it that never quite arrived. Zeus, in Nietzsche's reading, was not softening the blow with elpis. He was twisting the knife. It is a dark interpretation and not one that needs to be accepted as definitive, but it deserves to be placed alongside the gentler reading, because the myth itself places both possibilities in the same vessel and declines to arbitrate between them. This is what serious mythological thinking looks like, not simple moral instruction with a clear lesson appended at the end, but a story that contains its own contradictions and trusts its audience to live inside them. What both interpretations share, and what makes them both worth carrying forward, is the recognition that hope is not neutral. It is not simply the absence of despair. It is an active force, a presence in human life with its own weight and its own consequences, and the question of whether that weight is finally a gift or a burden is one that each individual life answers differently, and often answers differently at different points within the same life. There are mornings when hope is the only thing that makes the next hour possible, when the forward pull of believing that something will be better, that the diagnosis will come back clear, that the relationship can be repaired, that the work will eventually matter, is the single thread holding a person in the world. In those moments, elpis at the bottom of the vessel is the most precious thing imaginable, worth every argument for its ambiguity, worth every philosophical complication, worth all of Nietzsche's dark reading, because without it the alternative is simply darkness without exit. And there are other times when hope is the thing that makes it impossible to accept, to grieve, to let go, when the belief that something can still be saved keeps a person chained to a situation that is destroying them, when the expectation of better prevents the reckoning with what is, when hope functions precisely as the Stoics feared, as a mechanism of prolonged suffering dressed in the language of resilience. The Greeks, who lived in both of these times as all people do, did not pretend that hope resolved this tension. They simply said it was there, sealed in the vessel, present, permanent, available and unavailable in equal measure. And they let that image stand without explanation, because some truths are not well served by explanation. What hope's presence in the myth does accomplish, regardless of how you interpret its nature, is structural. It completes the story in a way that transforms it from simple catastrophe into something with genuine philosophical shape. Without Elpis, the Pandora myth is a story of pure loss. Creation as cruelty, humanity as victim. The vessel opens, and the world is broken, and there is nothing more to say. With Elpis, even held in ambiguity, even interpreted as potentially the most insidious content of all, the story becomes something else. It becomes a story about endurance, about the conditions of mortal life, not as a punishment to be passively received, but as a reality to be actively navigated, because that is what hope requires. It is not a passive state. To hope is to act as though the future is not already written, as though the present suffering is not the final word, as though the closed lid over the vessel is not a permanent condition, but a temporary one. Even the most philosophically skeptical reading of Elpis has to acknowledge that its presence in human experience, whatever its ultimate nature, produces behavior. It makes people move. It makes them build and create and reach and try again after failure in ways that a species without hope would not and could not do. Every hospital built, every seed planted in ground that drought destroyed the year before. Every book written in obscurity by someone who believed it might one day be read. Every apology offered across a silence that had seemed permanent. Every generation born into difficulty and raised to believe the world could be better than the one they inherited. All of it flows from the same source that Hesiod placed at the bottom of the vessel. The strange, compromised, philosophically complicated, absolutely indispensable force that remained when everything else had gone. The horrors flew out and covered the earth and became the permanent conditions of human life. And hope stayed. Not because it was too slow to escape, not by accident. It stayed because the story required it to stay. Because the people who built the story from the ground of their own experience knew, in the way that only genuine suffering teaches, that hope and suffering are not opposites. They are companions. They have always been companions. They came from the same vessel. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is what Pandora's story has always been trying to say. There is a reason the phrase has never left us. Not a single generation has passed since the story first took its written form in Hesiod's works and days that has not found a use for it. Not a single century of human history, with all its accumulated knowledge and technological advance and civilizational progress, has produced a moment in which someone, somewhere, did not look at a situation and reach instinctively for this particular image. Pandora's box. The thing you cannot unopen. The threshold you cannot uncross. The release of something into the world that the world will never be entirely rid of again. This linguistic survival, the persistence of a Bronze Age Greek myth as living metaphor in the daily vocabulary of the 21st century, is itself a phenomenon worth examining. We do not speak of most ancient myths this way. We do not routinely warn each other about Sisyphean dangers or Tantalian temptations in casual conversation, though both of those stories contain their own profound truths about human experience. We do not reach for the labors of Heracles as shorthand for difficult decisions, or invoke Persephone when discussing seasonal change. These myths live in literature and scholarship, and the educated memory of those who have sought them out. But Pandora's box lives in the vernacular. It lives in newspaper headlines and political speeches and scientific journals and everyday conversation among people who could not tell you Hesiod's name or identify a Pythos or explain the difference between Prometheus and Epimetheus. Why this one? The answer, when you follow it carefully, leads back to something fundamental about what the myth contains and what the modern world keeps producing. Pandora's box has survived, not as a piece of cultural decoration, but as a genuinely functional tool of thought, because the situation it describes, the irreversible release of uncontrollable consequences from a single act of opening, maps with extraordinary precision onto the central anxiety of modern civilizational life. We live, in the 21st century, in a world defined by open boxes, defined by the permanent, cascading, uncontainable consequences of discoveries and decisions made at specific moments in history that could not be undone once made. The splitting of the atom is the most obvious example, and the one most frequently cited in this context for good reason. On the 16th of July 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the first nuclear device was detonated successfully. The physicist J.J. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the fireball rise, recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Whether or not those were precisely the words that moved through his mind in that moment, they have attached themselves to it in cultural memory, because they capture what everyone in that desert understood immediately and viscerally. Something had been opened that could never be closed again. The knowledge of how to split the atom, of how to release the energy at the heart of matter in an uncontrolled chain reaction, was now in the world. It would spread, it would be replicated, it would be sought by every power that understood what it meant, and once sought it would be found, because the knowledge existed, and knowledge, like the contents of Pandora's vessel, does not unexist once released. The nuclear age is Pandora's box made historical fact, made concrete and measurable in megatons and fallout radii, and the precise number of warheads currently maintained by the 9 nations that possess them. Every arms control treaty ever negotiated, every non-proliferation agreement ever signed, every careful diplomatic effort to manage the spread of nuclear weapons technology has been an attempt to manage the consequences of a lid that was lifted in a New Mexico desert 8 decades ago. The box is open. The work of every subsequent generation has been to live inside that openness without being destroyed by it. But the nuclear example, for all its scale, is not the only one. In the decades following the Second World War, the boxes have multiplied. The development of the internet opened something that no single government or institution has since been able to contain or fully govern: the free movement of information across borders, the connection of every individual with access to a device to every other individual, similarly equipped, released consequences that the engineers and theorists of the early network could not have fully anticipated and certainly could not have controlled. The democratization of communication, the collapse of geographical barriers to knowledge, the rise of misinformation spreading at speeds and scales that outpace any corrective mechanism so far devised, the erosion of privacy as a practical reality of daily life. All of it from the same act of opening, all of it irreversible in the same fundamental way. Artificial intelligence presents the current generation with what may be the most direct parallel to the original myth that the modern era has yet produced. The development of systems capable of learning, reasoning, generating and acting at scales and speeds that exceed human capacity in specific domains is a box that the 21st century is in the process of opening right now, in real time, with consequences that those doing the opening freely acknowledge they cannot fully predict or control. The language used by researchers and ethicists and policymakers engaged with this question is saturated with the vocabulary of the myth without always acknowledging the source. Unintended consequences, irreversible thresholds, the danger of releasing something into the world that cannot be recalled, the question of what remains inside when everything else has gone. This is why Pandora's box has never left the language. It is not nostalgia. It is not the residual decoration of a classical education. It is because the myth identified something real about the structure of human discovery and human consequence, something that does not age, something that maps onto every era's defining anxieties, because it is describing a permanent feature of what it means to be a conscious, curious tool, using species moving through a world that does not come with an undue function. Every act of genuine discovery opens something. Every time human knowledge crosses a threshold it has never crossed before. The world on the other side of that threshold is different from the world before it, permanently and without appeal. This is not a reason to stop. It never has been. The Greeks did not tell the Pandora story as an argument for incuriosity. They were too honest and too Greek for that. A civilization that produced Socrates and Euclid and Herodotus and Archimedes was not a civilization that believed the cure for dangerous knowledge was ignorance. What they were doing in telling this story and keeping it alive and passing it forward across generations was something more sophisticated and more valuable than warning. They were insisting on honesty. They were saying, with the full weight of their mythological imagination behind it, that the act of opening carries consequences, that those consequences matter, that the world after the opening is different from the world before, and that any civilization serious about its own survival needs to reckon with that difference rather than pretend it does not exist. That reckoning is what we struggle with now, in every domain where a new box has been opened or is in the process of being opened. The reckoning is not a single decision made once and completed. It is an ongoing practice, a continuous effort to understand what has been released, to name it with Hesiod's precision and honesty, to accept that some of it will not be recovered, and to work within the changed world with the full knowledge of what the change cost. And then there is hope, still there, still at the bottom. The modern world has not found it any easier than Hesiod's world to resolve the ambiguity of Elpis. We still do not know with any certainty whether hope is the thing that saves us or the thing that keeps us suffering longer than we otherwise might. We still live inside that question on both the individual and the civilizational level. We hope that the boxes we have opened will not destroy us. We hope that the knowledge released will be navigated wisely. We hope that the intelligence, curiosity, and care that drove the opening in the first place will be equal to the task of managing the consequences. We do not know if that hope is well-founded. We cannot know. That is the nature of hope, and has always been. What we can know, and what the myth offers us as its final and most durable gift, is that we are not the first to stand at this place, not the first to look at a changed world and feel the weight of irreversible consequence and ask whether the opening was worth it, not the first to reach for hope in the bottom of a vessel that has already given out everything else it contained. Every generation that has kept this story alive and passed it forward has stood where we stand. Every one of them found a way to continue. Pandora's box is not a story about the past. It was never only a story about the past. It is a story about the permanent condition of a species that cannot stop reaching, cannot stop opening, cannot stop asking what is behind the closed lid, and must then live with complete honesty inside whatever answer it finds there. 3,000 years ago, a poet sat down and wrote about a woman and a vessel and a world changed forever in a single moment. He could not have known how long the story would travel. He could not have known the centuries it would cross, the languages it would move through, the countless new boxes it would be called upon to describe in eras he could never have imagined. But he knew the feeling, the opened lid, the changed world, the hope that stays. So do we.